emphasizing basically the same points you were making. Welcome back, everybody. My name is Deva Madhavadas, and I'm very happy to be with His Grace Harivilasa Prabhu. And this is our little mini-series on the Polis. These days, political discussion, I think most days, but especially these days, political discussion is on many people's minds. And so we thought to take a bit of a principled approach to these topics and try to incorporate the Dharmic or Vedic vision of things and see if it can help us inform a healthier vision of what we see right now, and also how we might be able to act ourselves in our own societies, wherever we might be. So welcome back, Harivilasa.
Thank you very much, sir.
Yeah, cool to see you. And if anybody hears any joyful noises in the background, that's Harivilasa on the other side of his wall is a roaring kirtan. So if you're wondering what that is, that's what you'll hear. Today's topic is Dharma and democracy. And I was a little nervous myself about this one because democracy is near and dear to many of our hearts. I myself grew up in the world's famous democracy, America, and I studied political science. And so I know how dear it is to many people, or at least familiar. And yet we see it many times, especially in the commentary of Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, whose books are the books that most of us have our informed views of Vedic culture around. He doesn't have, or he often has unkind things to say about democracy. And so then there's this kind of dichotomy that seems to be created. And I was wondering tonight if we could get into the idea right away of whether or not Dharmic culture and democracy are mutually exclusive. Is it possible to have both, or do they cancel each other out? Are they naturally opposed? So let's kick off our discussion that way. HVP, what do you think? Are Dharma and democracy mutually exclusive? Are they opposed to each other, or can there be some harmony?
Well, I think keeping to the spirit of our discussion series here, before we can even get tackle that question, we have to take a step back. And the question we have to definitely ask, well, what does it really mean, even democracy? As you were saying, many of us would say, okay, we live in a democracy. Most of us in the world know, okay, we live in democratic nations. But what exactly does that, what does that really mean? And how democratic is it really? And I think that's the one thing that we first have to discuss, that there are different, even amongst democracies, there's not just, it's not all equal, interestingly enough, even amongst democracies, it's not all, because there's something like direct democracy, which is in one sense, many of the arguments that are sort of proposed in favor of democracy, why democracy is naturally better, is the idea that, well, let everybody decide together, and then everybody's view will be heard, and then everybody has opportunity, and then you make the decision that will be the best for everyone. But realistically, we see that the direct democracy doesn't exist in the modern nation state. There's no such thing. But what has happened is that democracy just means, okay, everybody can vote for who will be in power. But that's very different. It's like very different. That doesn't mean you actually make the decisions. It looks exactly the same. You still have a government, and you have people there who do what they want to, and they have the power. They make the decisions, and everybody else has to experience. So I think that's maybe a good place to start. Like, how democratic is the democracy really?
Your point, which the classic idea of democracy, and actually Madison, who's one of the architects of America's democracy, which is the archetype for the rest of the world, in his Federalist Papers, James Madison would call this pure democracy, that a direct one-to-one representation, kind of the Greek archetype, although in Greece they also didn't even have direct democracy, but this that one person, one vote, and my vote is not for a person, but actually the issue itself. And we don't, as you're pointing out, although referendums offer that in some municipalities, you don't have that experience. What we have really is a republic in a formal sense, a representative democracy where we choose people to go and on our behalf make choices for us. And maybe we can get into a little bit how that came to be, the ethic of that. I want to save that for a little bit later, actually. But your story kind of reminds me of an experience I had in India, and we were going to go take a trip to a temple that was about a half hour away, and there was like 7 of us. And so one person said, well, we can just take my car. And then when we get there, he doesn't have a car. He has like this little rickshaw thing. And it could actually fit about 3 of us. And we all looked at each other like, how's this going to work? That we're 7 of us are going to make it a half-hour drive. It's not really a car. It was a rickshaw. And had we known that, we would have made other plans. But he represented it a little bit differently than what it actually is. So I think it's a good point that when we talk about democracy, it's helpful to recognize that's not what we really have in the pure sense. We have a republic, and that republic comes with certain dynamics, especially when it comes to the representatives.
Yeah, and what I also find interesting is that, in one sense, the assumption, or like the sort of worldview of thinking that one system is somehow the best system, and this is the thing that save us. I think that in itself is also quite problematic, because it's not really as simple as that. You can have good democracies and bad democracies, good monarchies and bad monarchies. And whatever it is, like you have, and I think that a lot of this rhetoric around system-based politics, saying that some system is somehow that's going to save everyone. If we can just institute this system, then things will necessarily be better. Now, not all systems are equal, but that we see it's not that simple. And what's fascinating is that if you would look, there's also a limit to how much a system can really change the form that government takes. We've seen it, for example, the great communist experiment. They tried to create something radically different. They tried to basically create a whole different way in which the world was run. But in the end, they got more or less the same form. It was the same. There was a president, there was a cabinet, there was ministers, it was still a hierarchy, there was still decisions coming from the top. It was just in name. Somehow now, okay, you don't call him a president, you don't call him a king. And there was the theory that at a certain point, the government will somehow magically disband, and then everybody will control everything. But it didn't. It actually stayed exactly the same form. So, and I think a lot of when we look at the republic, a republic and a monarchy is not that much different. Yes, definitely, a direct democracy is radically different, but a republic and a monarchy is not much different. It's more or less the same thing. Instead of a president, you have a king, and instead of it's so. And also, it has to be said, many of the things that are part of the modern republic are good things that are not necessarily connected to democracy. For example, a well-developed legal system, or the idea that everybody's equal before the law. Many of these things, it's not necessarily related just to the fact that you vote in a person and somehow all these other things magically come. So that also has to be disconnected in mind. It's not that you can only have human rights, quote unquote, in a democracy. You can have a monarchical king, and he can set the values of society also. So that also has to be said, that it's not just by the values that informs the society, is something that goes beyond the system, and that's also something we can look at.
Yeah, so an interesting point you're making. It seems that the overemphasis on system, and maybe to the detriment of missing out on other things that matter potentially more than the relative democracy, monarchy, etc. There's an interesting quote from Prabhupada. Maybe I can share my screen and bring that up. And he's pointing out that the actual function of monarchy is not so different from. Come on now. Chrome tab, share. Oh, it's not working.
Maybe you can put it in the comment.
Sure. I'll try it that way. I'll paraphrase, but he's pointing out that in terms of selecting a king and making decisions, it wasn't that the king acted autocratically. There were ministers, there was family members, there was audiences that the monarch would hold with his citizens, and he would receive feedback, and he would receive they would receive input and guidance from those different realms, and ultimately the decision was sitting with them. But the how to come to that decision wasn't just a kind of monolithic thought process coming from one person, all on their shoulders, all from their ego, so to speak. So I would like to ask you a question then, to your point. if not the system itself, if not democracy or communism or capitalism or monarchy, what are the things to give more attention to then?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very nice. So if we would look, for example, at, if you look at any society that actually had a functioning monarchy, then you would see all those societies have a massive, most of them, the successful ones at least, they have some serious system of educating leadership. Especially in ancient societies, there was like a whole. If you look at even in the Roman times, they had, for example, in the time of Marcus Aurelius, we know Marcus Aurelius well known as a benevolent dictator, a person that had a lot of power, but just was a fascinating ruler and just did so much good. But you see, many of those kings, they had what was called a Greek education, which meant when they were younger, they would live very austerely when they were very young. They would wear these woolen tunics. It's very uncomfortable. They would sleep on the floor, and they would be very much under discipline. They were very heavily disciplined by some teacher, by their educators, by their teachers. And the idea was that we will now prepare these children for the day that they become kings, for the day they become rulers. Because the principle was you first have to control your senses before you can occupy a position of leadership. So we see that, and the same thing in the Vedic culture. I mean, if you look at the Manu Samhita, in which a lot of the duties of the king is described, it's clearly said it only works when you have a king that is properly trained in the Vedic principles. Otherwise, the monarchy. So they just understood. Listen, it's very simple actually. Give him a lot of authority and power, but before you do that, invest in his proper education and his proper training. So that is that it is like they are people centered. So the idea is that you don't have to make it all complicated. Just understand that really the success of the system depends on having a person that can use power properly. And this you can do. You can try and invest in the proper education and training. But then you have to have a whole culture of teaching people. And that is like a whole shift. And that's oftentimes, if you look at Prabhupada's criticism of democracy, that was his criticism. His criticism was of democracy, if you look at specifically, is that you have people simply voted into power with no training. And that's what his big problem was, is that people are just because of vote. Whereas in other society where you prioritize people, where you prioritize the understanding that the system is only as good as the person that embodies the authority, then you have a whole different emphasis. This is one story where Prabhupada once they went to, it's very funny, they went to some party, a political speech. This was like in the hippie era, so in New York City. And then it was by some subversive political party, or some young hippie people who wanted to get into government. And then there was the pre-show was a bunch of guys dressed as bananas who were jumping around, singing on the stage, some kind of a song that was playing on the fact that one of these urban myths that if you smoke the inside of banana peels, you can get high. So this things. And they said, the person, I can't remember, I was reading the memories, and he's saying he was sitting next to Prabhupada when they were in there. Prabhupada was looking very serious. He wasn't laughing. He didn't think it was funny. He was looking at this thing, and he's just like seeing these guys in banana suits jumping around there. And it wasn't funny because he was like, "What? This is not funny." So then, in any case, and then the person spoke, and Prabhupada did his thing, and they went back. And then they were sitting in Prabhupada's room, and they were speaking. And then one person said, "Yes, he wants to run for president. He can't run for president because he's not 30 years old. You have to be at least 30 to run for president of the United States," or some rule like that. And Prabhupada just looked at him, and he put his hand over his head, and he started laughing. And he was like shaking, he was laughing like anything. The one person, why is Prabhupada laughing? And then he realized, because just the ridiculousness of the situation. You think that guy can't be the president because he's not 30. And you think somehow, if he becomes 30, then that will somehow solve the problem, and then he will be able, then he can run for president. So very interesting that if you understand that your only hope is in having the proper person in charge, if you understand that's your hope, and there is not some system that will save you, how different will be the priorities of our society, and how different, if you think about our education system or the culture that we live in, really changes then.
I love the point, and that was also a criticism Prabhupada made, or you could say potential criticism that he made of monarchy, just exactly to what you're saying. I figured out how to share my screen here. So Prabhupada is saying, no, now either democracy or monarchy, the population is Shudra. So either you make it democracy or any Krasi, Shudra will be on the power. And then he explains everyone in Kali Yuga, Shudra indicating somebody with a low consciousness, somebody who's just concerned with their money, their immediate situation, eating, sleeping, mating, defending, that stuff. Prabhupada saying down here, who is interested? He'll go to the factory. Instead of becoming Brahmana, he'll be a hammerman in America. So no students are coming to the philosophy class. So to your point that there's not an interest in higher mindedness, a life of integrity, a life of value, and maybe we can say then the only advantage then of having a democracy to select such people is that every 4 years or 6 years or 2 years you can cycle them out. You're not stuck with a knucklehead for 4 decades. And yet it's a kind of variety show of knuckleheads instead. It's not that you get anyone better than the previous option, this wet stool and dry stool that was certainly the choice this last year here in America. And yet people have their preference still, because rather than being stuck with somebody for a couple of decades, you only have to deal with them for 4 years.
Yeah, I think that's a nice point. I believe political systems that arise, the best political system will be the one. There's like many things in society. It's like the best way to do it, it will come up. So in one sense, democracy is quite, at least when we say democracy, like the way in which we currently do our whole government system, it works basically designed to minimize the loss when you have a bad leader. It's very well designed for that. Like if you have a really bad person, a monarchy sucks. If you have a bad king, then you're like, because then you're sitting with it's a whole big problem to get rid of him. And interesting to note, we see even in the Vedic literature, there is procedures for that. When you do have a king and that is not proper, then the Brahmanas will come together, and then the Brahmanas are supposed to dethrone him, or like in the real emergency sense. So it's, I think when we read many of these ancient things, the king is God, the king is God. But at the same time, they understood that it's more of the position, is like a position that is ordained by divine order, the fact that someone has to be in charge. But the moment the person is not acting properly, then there's means by which it can be disposed. But the democracy is good for that. The democracy has all kinds of safeguards and protective measures in place that if you don't get a good leader, that his damage will be minimal. But the price of that is also that if you get a good leader or a good president, his contribution will be minimal. That's the other reality.
Great point.
And if you think specifically that the fact that we have this 4-year cycle, it's also just sometimes super impractical. There are certain problems that cannot be solved in human society. And the price of that is also that if you get a good leader, that cannot be solved in less than 4 years. And basically, you can't solve the problem in less than 4 years. The government can't do anything about it, because you're going to build up a whole system like we saw in America. You have Obamacare, something like this, a whole elaborate system that is made up. But that thing takes years to build up and to implement. And then just the next term, someone else comes and says, no, we don't want to do this anymore. And then everything just collapses and you go in a different direction. And that is like that is a serious problem. That is like a serious systemic issue in terms of having a government that can deal with deep-rooted problems in society if every 4 years the government changes.
No, we were talking a little bit offline, and you're pointing out just how inefficient that is also. It's just a huge expenditure of resource to be onboarding. Companies, they allocate millions of dollars to training and onboarding somebody and hiring somebody, or many somebodies each year, and it's considered very cumbersome. And so then to have that happening every 2 to 4 to 6 years, 8 years, really weighs on a nation, and it also erodes trust for the citizenry. Obamacare is a good example. Many people in general, whether Republican or Democrat, they felt that Obamacare was a helpful solution in general. They were comforted by the idea that they were going to get a more stable healthcare, more accessible healthcare experience. And so to have that washed away, or at least attempted to within 4 years, was very frustrating for many people, to your point. So I wanted to ask you then, given this, and it sounds like you already have given us something of an answer, but is it necessary to come up with an alternative to democracy? Because it seems like that is the way things are trending. And just one comment to something you mentioned earlier about the nature of monarchy. Oftentimes it's assumed, especially with the Western idea of a monarchical situation, that the monarchy is the social head. The monarch is the ruler. In the Vedic paradigm, though, it's the monarch is actually not the ruler. The monarch is the administrative head of society, but the social head of society is the spiritual class, the brahmanas, which is something that may not be so familiar to some people that are coming to the discussion. So, given all things considered, is it necessary to come up with an alternative to democracy, especially in the modern context where most places and most people trend towards that direction in terms of what they value?
Well, as I said before in our first discussion, I think there's a limit really to how much one can really change the world political situation. Firstly, it's like we can come up with a new philosophy, but say we can make a part. Okay, our goal, one of the goals of the eighth goal of the International Society for Krishna Consciousness is to reinstitute monarchy in all. It's like, is that really? I think, as I said, the world situation is a reflection. Prabhupada, oftentimes when they would ask him about changing the world, he would say, no, the world is a reflection of the condition of people, but it's a reflection of the consciousness of the human society especially. So if you change that, then everything else also change. Firstly, I think democracy as a decision-making process is fine. We see that there's a big scope for that. Whenever you have equals, people who are relatively equal in their specific, whatever the important criteria is for making the decision, whether it's like specific knowledge or responsibility or experience, when you have equals together and it's a relatively small group, democracy is the most natural way. And we tend towards that. It's natural. You have a group of people, okay, let's decide together. But the moment that there is a differentiation in
expertise,
aptitude or expertise, then it changes. And what's fascinating is that the whole rest of the world functions on that model. The military world, the medical world, the engineering world, the educational world, the accounting world. Realistically, every single sector of society functions on the basis of expertise and the basis that that decisions, there's a certain person who makes a decision. So as I said before, I think the world in one sense still, it's not really that different than a monarchy. And how much we can change it, I'm not really sure. I think that it's more important for us to see that Prabhupada's suggestion also was, if you create leaders with integrity and you can create spiritualists, spiritual counselors that have some actual spiritual realization, then whenever these people enter into any kind of system, they will naturally change the system by just embodying that position. So Prabhupada, for example, said that the hope for America is if they can elect a Krishna conscious ruler. Interesting. His ideas will change it not by having if that's the way the system is currently working, you just add that positive consciousness. If you add a ruler with real integrity, and I do think at a certain point, a devotee might become like a president, or at least a person who is living the principles of devotional life and who understands it, because people will see that this is a ruler, this is a real person who has the qualities. And then in that sense, I think the system is changed. At least our contribution to the thing is that our emphasis is very much on the consciousness. At least our society and spiritual, we're interested in changing the consciousness, and then we think that will naturally change the system.
I want to have you come back to that point, because it might be an answer or something of an answer to another question I wanted to bring out. I just wanted to appreciate going back to something you said just a moment ago about how aptitude or expertise changes the democratic experience. It's a natural thing amongst peers to want to take a consensus, but that's amongst peers. And so if we're dealing with an environment where somebody has expertise and somebody doesn't, then we want to give deference to that person that has that expertise. And that's sometimes lost in democracy. And that's to a few moments earlier, you pointed out how American democracy especially is very good at kind of stifling influence and creating a kind of logjam. And that was very intentional amongst the founding fathers. And if anybody's curious to read the classic literature, the Federalist Papers, particularly James Madison's writings, Federalist 10 and number 14, they really outline this, you could say, pessimistic idea and paranoia even about the influence of faction. Any particular group that would gain undue influence, not even necessarily undue, but just influence that could
Yeah.
overthrow the rest of the society in a way. And so it was created this system of checks and balances, which oftentimes does frustrate and prevent expertise from being able to shine through and actually have its effect.
Definitely, yeah. I mean, it is fascinating how you see in general now many people who have serious leadership aptitude. They
Mm,
don't go into the political realm because
mm,
it's so damn frustrating.
yeah.
They would rather go into the corporate realm because in the
Yes.
corporate realm, it's like, listen, you're the head of a company. It's just like the world is your playing field. There's a few basic rules you have to, don't get caught, and then you can just go conquer.
Yep.
So interesting how, and in general, you see the people who enter into modern political positions in general. That oftentimes people who are not they need it because it gives security. It's very boring. It's like you can't really change anything. So that's not very exciting for someone who
Mm,
is really interested into leadership and into helping people. You see also sometimes that's where people rather go. You would have many successful NGOs or sometimes
yeah.
run by people who had a stint. They tried to do the public service thing and they just got too depressed. And then they're like, screw that. I rather just begin my own little company and work in my own little field. And there's also something to say for the reality that because you're asking about, whatever, if you're looking at the future of what's happening in government, the one thing that we can say, whether Republican or Democratic or monarchy, whatever you want to call it, putting that little detail aside, the mechanism of electing your ruler, if you forget that for a moment and you just look at what has happened, the reality is that government is becoming much more totalitarian just in its power. The power of government is just increasing exponentially.
Mm,
And it's interesting if you look, for example, one of the big problems with democracy now, as you said, the modern republican system, is that the government is impersonal.
mm.
It's this thing. It's just like this block of this government
Yeah.
thing, and
They.
no one is to blame.
Everyone talks about they.
They decided. The
Yeah.
government decided. But in a monarchical system, basically, the real distinction between a monarchy and democracy, a better way to term it, because this word democracy is just loaded. It's, as we said, it's not really
So is
democratic.
monarchy.
Exactly. The best way, another way to see it is if you make the distinction. This is done by a philosopher, a political philosopher, American actually, at the University of Las Vegas. He wrote a book called Democracy, the God That Failed.
Mm,
And which is a pun, there was a book called Communism, the God That Failed, which was
mm,
released just after Second World War by a Russian author, just speaking about how it was like actually to live in communist era, to say that the whole social experiment failed. So he wrote this book, Democracy, the God That Failed. And he basically forget about ideology, forget about, religious beliefs, all this kind of stuff. He just looks at the dynamics of economics and efficiency. And he's just showing how a government, the democratic form of government, has serious limitations. As we said, for example, the fact that every 4 years you have recycling of power. And the other problem is that a monarchy is privately owned government. It means the government belongs to a person. Like,
mm.
that's what it means. It means there's a king and he owns the government, but he's responsible.
He's accountable. Yeah.
He, if he messes up, he's the one. Like, as a person, he's standing there. And now, versus the modern system, there's no one is responsible. Like, even like, you can see how difficult it is to put a president to task, because for his decisions he makes, it's just like the government. It's like the government does it, and then somehow nothing happens to the people. Whereas,
Mm,
what's also fascinating is that if you look at, if you compare like even European monarchies, I'm not even speaking about your Vedic, Ram Raj, like this ideal idea of the perfect king. I'm speaking just like, average European monarchy 200 years ago, or whatever.
mm,
Then you would see that there's certain things that a monarch or king could never do that the government can do today. For example, one of the big things, forced conscription. Forced conscription is like that is not something that was easily done.
That means a draft. A draft.
A
Right?
draft.
Forced to go fight in the military.
You just take an average person and say, listen, here's a gun, and here you go. You have to go fight in a war. Like, that was like maybe in like severe emergency, like if someone is coming to attack your town, okay, then all citizens bear arms. But to send them like to some other country to fight, if you look at European monarchies at least, they had to pay every single soldier. Everyone had to pay, and also they had to hire them. And it's like if they didn't want to fight, then they don't fight. It's as simple as that. And if you can't raise an army, then you can't fight war. It was as simple
Yeah.
as that. And now it's like the government's like, oh shoot, we don't have enough people in the army. Let's draft. Let's just do a draft, and then you just pull everyone in. So, and you know, it's interesting. There's very few countries that have. Generally, it always goes together. Universal suffrage, or the right to vote, is the precursor to conscription, which is very interesting, because the metaphysical principle is that, listen, if you want to cast that vote, if you want to be part of the political power game, then you have to fight. You know, like then you're going to be because we see that politics means war. Politics and war it's the same field. So very interesting that government is definitely becoming more and more totalitarian due to a combination of its impersonal nature. So it's just continually expanding its influence. Taxation is everywhere.
Yeah.
And also by technology, they can actually enforce many of these things. I think it's not necessarily that the past people were less controlling. It's just you couldn't control so much. You couldn't have so much. You couldn't exert so much control over the average person. But now, because of technology, because all our life is lived in this technological world is very easy to control. You know, you can much more easy to control and observe in people. Whereas in the past, people were. Robert said it. The general idea is people were independent. And that was in the Vedic society, the average person was quite independent, economically independent, and even for many things, it was just people were much more decentralized. There wasn't like these big centralized forms of control and government. So many of the people that are now arguing against totalitarian government, in one sense, the Vedic ideal is much more decentralized, much more simple.
Yeah, let me take that a second, and then I'd like you to elaborate. I was going to ask the question, what do you think the kind of Dharmic Vedic perspective can do to inform a healthier democratic experience? So maybe you'd like to run with that. But this concern you're expressing now, this totalitarian element that we've kind of seen just burgeon and continue to grow, that was anticipated by the anti-federalists of America. And so within the Constitution of America, there's a famous, you could say, amendment document called the Bill of Rights. And that Bill of Rights, which started as 10, and then they made a way for others to be written. So the Anti-Slavery Act, the Women's Suffrage Act, those were amendments added to the Bill of Rights going forward. These were a bill of clauses that the Anti-Federalists put in to try to check the growing power of government that they saw becoming the de facto experience when the Federalists were creating this very stifled kind of top-heavy system. And so the experience of a localized kind of independence was the concern of the anti-federalists. They felt like a states' rights is kind of the common way we hear this discussed now. And I'm noticing that even in very kind of, you could say, not traditionally conservative areas like Oregon in the US is a very leftist or liberal state, generally, politically speaking. And yet they've just done something very conservative from a political perspective in creating drug policy for their own state that's way outside of the federal policy, and basically decriminalizing all of the drugs that formerly would get somebody prosecuted and put in federal prison. And so that's a very conservative move with a modern liberal take. And the irony is that that's much more of a classic Vedic monarchy move to be able to make, because you don't have this large bureaucratic infrastructure, big brother, watching your every move. How you take care of yourselves in your small little fiefdom is up to you. And as long as you pay your tax and you're not creating too much problem for everybody else, then the bigger king, the emperor, however you refer to them, they don't mind what you're doing or not doing. And you don't mind what they're doing or not doing, as long as you're not getting harassed by other provinces and, grain is coming and water is available. That's about the extent of what you expect from each other.
And it's very interesting because at least the idea you get in the Vedic ideal, in India at least. So one thing has to be understood, when kings were ruling, in general, it was like it was similar to states. You had kingdoms and different kings would do things differently. And then even if you have an emperor, the emperor in general, it would just mean, where did the tax go? Where does But the emperor does, like if you read, for example, about Krishna only interfered, like Krishna, Yudhishthira, they interfered in certain instances where there was like something really off happening. Then the
Yes.
emperor would go in and interfere, and that's fine. And we see that in one sense, America does also play that role in the world. It's a fact. Sometimes, people just, it goes completely out of hand. It goes completely adharmic. And then whoever is in control, they have some kind of responsibility to go in and say, hey, you can't just, slaughter people or torture civilians, whatever. So that was even there in Krishna's time. Like they would go when Jarasandha was there, he was offering so many humans in sacrifice, so they made a plan to remove him. And they said, this guy is not a proper ruler. So also
Otherwise, he was allowed, the other rulers were allowed to do their thing. But when he began to aberrate from basic decency, that's when there was the intervention.
And you know what was interesting? How do you keep it in check? The big thing was people were free to emigrate to other cities. That's very fascinating, because the moment you put that in, now immediately you have the same. If you remove, now obviously I'm not arguing against immigration borders. You have to just understand that it's not so simple to just change one element of the equation. I think that's going to solve the problem. But I'm saying, imagine this world. You have this. So imagine just India at that time. So if all these specific monarchical rulers are ruling their cities, mostly like city-states with some kingdom, with an outlying kingdom, but the principle was that people could move freely. So therefore, you are in one sense, the citizens vote by where they move. And if you're going to mess up, then people will leave.
Yes.
And imagine that's what you're seeing. Like now, certain of these countries that are horribly ruled, that would be the natural tendency, is people would leave. Like that's like, listen, you're completely screwing us over. This thing is horrible. We're going to go to another country where they will take care of us. And in the past, you see that was like great, because more people means better. It's like means more economy. It means more workers. Everything is better, because now naturally in the modern world, because of technology again, you have people that are becoming people become a problem. Whereas in a pre-industrial technology, more people is good. More people means more work.
Yeah, more production, more connection, more industry. Yeah.
But now, that's why in the modern world you can't do that. If the US just says, okay, everyone, if you want to come and work here, what will happen? You have a big problem, because
there's no work for them.
There's no work for them, exactly, and then they become a burden on the system.
Yeah.
But very interesting that in the past, that's how people voted, and that kept rulers naturally in check. Because if you're going to oppress your people, you're going to treat them badly, they're all going to leave. And then who are you going to rule over? So very fascinating, just how that kind of natural check by the people, in one sense, how that was naturally there. They voted by where they would live. And rulers compete for people by trying to offer the best services.
Well put. Another, interestingly, we could say, modern liberal ethic, or that is carried by natural monarchy. So maybe, again, segueing into this kind of question, what other principles do you see the kind of dharmic social value system having for our modern experience of democracy where we are? How could dharmic principles inform a more wholesome democratic experience?
Wow, that's a big one. Wow, you go first. You must have. If you ask the question, you might have an idea.
Well, my own frustration this last election cycle, aside from no man of principle or woman of principle being a real option to elect, was the unnatural and very unwholesome influence of putting so much pressure on people for their civic engagement, people that don't actually belong thinking about these things. And that really came clear for me this last election cycle. Just use an example from my own personal life outside of the political sphere to help see this ethic in dharmic culture. My dad is an excellent brick mason. He can make anything with bricks or stone, anything. He's really good. And because he's really good, he was encouraged at one point in his life to start his own business, because he'll get to make more money, set his own hours, all the reasons you start your own business. And I can remember that was the most frustrating, stressful time of my family's life, aside from when my mom got sick much later on. But when we were all together under one roof, that was the most frustrating time of our life, when my dad was trying to run his own business, because he's not a businessman. He's excellent at laying brick and running a job site even. But when it comes to hiring and firing and setting prices and dealing with customers and insurance and paperwork, all those things are not his nature. He can do them, but it puts him in anxiety to have to think about it. And so that in the kind of classic Vedic conception, he would be considered more of a Shudra personality in terms of his work style. Just show him where to build the thing and he'll build you a beautiful thing. But he'd rather not have to think about the rest of it. Whereas somebody who's more business minded is considered like a Vaishya. And then there's the Kshatriya class, or the administrative class, who has this kind of capacity to think in a broader vision about the welfare of all the people. And then there's the Brahminical class, who has that capacity to think about the spiritual upliftment ultimately of everyone. This is general, very simplified terms for the sake of our discussion. And so putting that pressure on the people in general to think about economic policy with China and how they should feel about economic policy with China. Meanwhile, they can't even stop themselves from beating their wife, right? Or figure out how to sit down with their kids and do an hour's worth of math homework without like wanting to rip their hair out. And then to put on their lap on top of it, figuring out the right person to execute, foreign policy, healthcare, fix our transportation, roads, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's a very unnatural, unhealthy pressure to put on most people's plates. And so it's a kind of evil of democracy that I see. And somehow if we could create a more healthy expectation or lack thereof for people, I think that would go a long way towards healing society's relationship to leadership.
Definitely. Yeah, that's a very interesting point, just how, because if you look at countries that still have monarchs, you will see that the monarch's relationship, kings in general, with the public people, it was just sort of like a celebrity. That's what people actually want. They want celebrity. There's the king and there's the family, and they're so interested. They're interested in their life.
They're fascinated.
They're fascinated by them, and that's what most people generally. That's what they need to know about the government. Like the ceremonial function of the king as the person. Okay, here's the person, and that's what most
somebody to be proud of, somebody to be commonly like interested in.
Someone to be the focal point of people's devotion, ultimately. That's how it works. Like even in big, like if you look at Steve Jobs, he was worshipped. People worshipped him, and therefore his company flourished. It's just like a worship, or that is the basic principle how this whole thing works. Is if there's great adoration and respect for a leader, then that's actually the force that has everything flow. But that's what is needed from people, is the support and adoration, not their consideration of foreign policy or their opinion on whatever, all these complicated things. And again, it's due to technology. It's because of the fact that now you can have the news that stand there and newscasts are saying, and then everybody hears it. In the past, it would be so cumbersome to broadcast that information to everyone. And also, what's the point of doing it? So, very nice thing. Like, see, amazing how this technological reality has influenced the social dimension so much, especially when it comes to politics. And one thing, as we were speaking, that I think would be interesting for us, because there's the whole global stage, and the globe is what it is. But then, what is interesting, as I was thinking, how I also think a lot about the future of ISKCON's development. Now, ISKCON is a very interesting society because, in one sense, it is. I mean, it's very.
And for those that may not know, that's the kind of religious society that supports the Bhakti movement that Harivilasa and I are part of.
Yes, so the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, and in one sense, a religious corporation, one could call it, at least in American law terms, and has its own ecclesiastical body and whatever it is. Now, in the past, I think a lot of our future social development, and that's what I think most people are waking up to now, is that to change the world is a useless goal. Like it means baking. What are you doing? You're just going to waste your time. You can change the world. What you can do is, though, you can have a local influence. Now they're saying, many people, they're shifting. They're saying, instead of trying to change the world, let me build a community. Let me build a community where I actually live in. What do I really care? If I live, in rural Kansas on some kind of a farm and I produce my own food, what do I really care about?
China has foreign economic policy.
Exactly. I mean, if it influences you, it influences me. But that was also Prabhupada's system, is become independent, create some independence in your communities. And what I found very interesting is, I was thinking, in our society, we've tried that. We've tried to create farm communities that are independent. It was difficult. What is interesting is that we faced a lot of the same difficulties that Republican governments face. For example, unstable leadership. That's reality. It's very risky in one sense to go live on an ISKCON farm, because you don't know, because it depends on the president of that project. And you don't know what will happen. He can move. And then you move there and then you get another president you don't like, and then what do you do then? Or so very interesting, like stability of leadership is a similar issue we have faced. And also the other reality is that, and it's also because it's not privately owned. And I was thinking it's very interesting because the future of monarchy, when we say, okay, we are into how will we contribute to the resurgence of of monarchy, in the modern world. Prabhupada said it's a good system. Does it mean to change? No. But I think, in one sense, how I see it naturally happening is that you would have in the future perhaps personal people, privately owned communities, like a person who says, like, listen, I have money. I buy a big farm and I invite other people to live here, but I'm the king, meaning that it's just my private property. So if you follow, I have certain rules and expectations, and it's stable. It's my property. It will go to my children, and in that sense, what's very interesting is that can provide that provides a big alternative to a very different way in which even our own communities can be developed. And then you will have a natural kind of monarchy to a certain extent. You have some of the same benefits, and then it's like people, if the project is properly run, people will come because people need shelter. Many people are looking that they just basically they say, listen, we can work, we can contribute, we just need some shelter, we need a place to stay, and we don't want to be part of modern society, we want to clock out. And if you have in that sense, you have a privately owned project and you say, listen, you can come. You can make an application to come. It's not just anyone come. We can see if you're willing to abide by our ethos. And that is a very interesting way in which you will, in one sense, have a little bit of a monarchical thing again arising. And there's no, these projects can actually become quite big. And then it is a privately owned government to a certain extent. Yeah? For better or worse, it will be, in one sense, experiment.
Interesting. To play devil's advocate, well, let me actually just move ahead because I like where you're going with this. And so that was going to kind of be my concluding question for us. And it's a good wrap up time now, maybe. I was going to ask, what kind of civic engagement do you recommend for people today? And you just gave one, potential, which is to kind of join an autonomous experience, basically, and take more accountability for your own infrastructure, choose your leader wisely, etc. But let's say for the person who's, sitting in Ypsilanti, Michigan, or Brooklyn, New York, and they're not going to join any kind of commune anytime soon, what kind of civic engagement, if any, do you recommend for people today?
I mean, that's such a difficult question because one of the problems we see, like you're saying, in the modern understanding is that somehow everybody should have the same level of civic engagement. It's sort of like this is everybody should vote and everybody should do this and everybody should be involved. And I really think that you should just understand who exactly you are. Like that's the first. I said not everybody needs the same level of civic engagement. And one man's poison is another man's food. Like you were saying, for your father when he started running a business, it caused him so much stress. For someone else, they love it. That's what makes them happy. Is all the stress and all the stuff. So that's the first thing, is to see that if you find yourself consistently overwhelmed, when you look at the political thing, when you try to engage, why do that? Just clock out. Why waste your life? God, life is so short. Do you really want to waste it? You can judge by your own level of the experience. And secondly, it's fine if you look at the bigger scale. If you're looking for civic engagement, I think if you have an interest, you want to be civically engaged and take part in the political process of government, whatever it is. If you have that desire to be part of that world, put your focus mostly on local. That's what I would say. If you want to do it local. It's like clock in where you can take. The big question is that where can you take responsibility? If you want to change, take responsibility for something. And then if it can be like someone in your neighborhood, you be part of a community garden project, or you're part of a project that takes care of the homeless in your community, whatever it is. If see where you can actually take responsibility for a real thing that's happening. That is the best way to channel the desire for civic engagement. If you want to be civically engaged, like local solutions, that's where the most of the like you can see so many people, they sit and watch the news about what's happening on a global scale, but totally uninvolved in their own neighborhood, totally not caring. They say things about, they say yes, whatever. They either vote, they say yes, we should have some big a multi-billion-dollar plan to take care of the homeless, but then there's a homeless guy sleeping right at the door. So I think that civic engagement, and that's how in the past, is that locally involved would be a better way to go it. And if it's not your responsibility, then probably best not to worry about it. Like focus your circle of concern on your circle of influence. Like there are some people that you think about global events. These are the people who have to make those decisions. And I think that that's a good way to gauge it. Wherever you can have responsibility, there your decisions will actually make a change, and there you should focus your attention and your time. And if you don't really have any kind of influence, then better to restrict your concern to something else, like your own life or whatever. Like focus your circle of influence and your circle of concern. Have them overlap one another.
Yeah. I really like that. I like how you said also that you began that with, know yourself first. And the irony of, and we've alluded to it a little bit, the establishment of democracy was actually the founding fathers in America. They recognized that the average man doesn't have the capacity, even in their everyday life, especially 250 years ago, to understand what's going on in the world. Mm. You have to grind your grain, and you have to wash your clothes on a washboard in the river, and you have to start a fire to cook your food. Life takes so much time that the average man doesn't have, or woman doesn't have the time otherwise to consider these things deeply. Therefore, they should pick somebody else to do it for them. Now, the irony is today, 250 years later, I do have the time and I have the access, but my level of influence is still 250 years old. Yeah. The same access and influence is what it was 250 years ago, although the information that's coming to me, is in a modern, accessible experience. So recognizing that it's a recipe for frustration. Act locally, and don't even worry about thinking globally. Just continue to think locally, act locally. That's where I myself have also found deep satisfaction. Political scientist, I wanted to do these things, change the world for the better. I like to think I have some kind of mind for thinking about this stuff, but my own sense of fulfillment and satisfaction has come through attempting to build community. And so for our Krishna conscious attempts here to do something like that, my own advice or answer to the question where we're at in our Harmony Collective development here in Ypsilanti, Michigan, after several years of building out our own community infrastructure, you could say in-house, I'm now looking at ways which we can connect in a healthy, integrated way with the local community, the rest of Ypsilanti, the people who aren't necessarily Krishna conscious. And that's one thing I wanted to point out to the Dharmic version is actually it's a very accommodating system, because rather than a winner-take-all experience that we see now in the kind of totalitarian democracy you were speaking to earlier, there's a lot of room for different groups of people to coexist in a healthy Dharmic atmosphere. Mm-hmm. And I think we have that to bring to the conversation to help people see how they don't have to hate each other just because they disagree on certain practices, because at principle, oftentimes values of all humans are the same. We're all looking for a few fundamental experiences, safety, connection, etc. And if we can experience each other first from that principled platform, then the details don't have to get so ugly as they are today, where you see people not even being able to have a civil conversation with one another. So that would be my answer to that question. Go ahead.
Very nice. I think that's a concluding point, because we started at the beginning of the discussion and we asked the question about, we saw that the main distinction between thinking the system will save us versus understanding that ultimately it's about the state of consciousness of the people who are in power. And, and when you say state of consciousness, what does that mean? How do you assess the state of consciousness? And then we see states of consciousness are described in the Vedic scriptures elaborately in terms of qualities. That is how consciousness is described, in terms of qualities. Like, for example,
it's not an arbitrary or religious affiliation.
Exactly. Like if you would read the description of the Vedic ruler, it doesn't say you have to be a member of the Protestant church, or he has to be
or Hindus or Muslims.
the Hindu, no, it says that, it says he has to have the qualities of courage, valor, for charity, heroism. So there's qualities. So I think that is really the contribution that each of us can make, is in the qualities, because these qualities, it's like the whole world is like one connected field. And if you will manifest the good qualities in that little sphere of influence that you have there in Ypsilanti, Michigan, if you can manifest the qualities that are the divine qualities, then that will change the world. And those qualities are everywhere. Those qualities can be cultivated in everyone, regardless of your official religious affiliation. So that is, and it's not a cop-out. It's not, sometimes people think that, what they call it, spiritual bypassing, whatever, that you sort of bypass your responsibility to participate in the realities of the world by the spiritual excuse. But we see, no, we're just saying that you have to develop these qualities within the level of responsibility that you have somehow been ordained by God. Because that is also understanding that each one of us, we are bestowed upon us is a certain realm of influence. And we just see that it is just that each of us, we just have a field. And that field, other people will be in that field. Other people will be influenced by you to a certain extent. And if one can develop these qualities, that is the starting point of any kind of bigger change, whether it is within our local communities or in the global community. And therefore, we see that Prabhupada said, or at least the principle, therefore, is at the root of it all is a certain sense of devotion. We see that how it comes.
Sense of responsibility.
Devotion towards what is true and what is beautiful and what is good, and devotion towards Krishna. That is the root cause of the development of these qualities. And in the absence of those qualities, nothing will save us. That is nothing, no system,
no policy,
no institution, no whatever it is, nothing. If those qualities are not there, because these institutions, they simply can direct those qualities. But I use the analogy usually of finance and accounting. Like the accountant does not make money. He can just funnel it and he can sort of direct it in certain places. But the money is something much different. So similarly, these qualities of consciousness, they can be to a certain extent directed by institutions and policies and systems. But at the root, it is something very different. So we tried our best to take a look at democracy. I mean, you can only do so much in an hour. And as many of you can see, I think there's so many other things to explore. But I think covered, you would say the essence was just to help us think a little bit critically about just the whole principle of systems and democracy in particular. And I hope no one is upset with us.
Me too, although if they're not angry, you're not sharing something worthwhile, Prabhupada said once. So I don't mind if a few people are upset. It's a good sign.
Yeah.
However, I really loved what your concluding ideas there. And just to kind of boil it down to a modern language, the question of rights versus responsibility. And we discussed last week a little bit about how John Locke, a political philosopher who was hugely influential on the founding fathers' psyche, he also boiled it down to this, that when a society considers itself in terms of natural law versus natural rights, it's more powerful to consider natural law or the universal principles of what is valuable, what is wholesome, what is good, and how can I support those? And if I see myself as supportive of serving that experience of natural law, that's what's going to create a wholesome society. Whereas if I get too concerned with what are my rights, my natural rights of land and property and wealth and influence and power, then I slip into a selfish consciousness that's bad for me and certainly bad for those around me. So I liked how you said, if we look at our sphere of influence and consider how can I contribute to them experiencing good qualities, that's really the best thing we can do. So yes, thank you everyone who's joined. Please forgive us. It was a daunting topic, but I'm actually feeling really good about the conversation. I felt like some beautiful points were made, certainly instigated some things inside of me. So I thank you again, Harivilasa Prabhu. This whole series has been your idea, so thank you. And everyone who's enjoying it, please especially give your blessings to Harivilasa. And we hope to see you back again next week. We have 6 more episodes in our intended series. So we're hoping to be back with you again next Tuesday. Hare Krishna.
Thank you very much.
Haribol.